In the nearly 47 years since joining the government, I worked for 8 presidents. As a result, I've learned a few things about service and about leadership from all the great men and women I've been privileged to serve or work with in some capacity, including, I might add, the recently departed Margaret Thatcher. But the leader who educated and inspired me most was a figure I never met or worked with, and that is General George Marshall, in how he lived his life and how he served his country. As Secretary of Defense, his portrait was on the wall behind my desk, hanging alongside my other hero, his partner in command, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Marshall was the gold standard for what I consider the most important character trait, and that is moral courage. Late in 1917, during World War I, George Marshall was on the commander's staff in France conducting an exercise for the American Expeditionary Force. General Blackjack Pershing, then U.S. commander, was in a foul mood. He dismissed critiques from one subordinate after another and stalked off. But then Captain Marshall took the arm of General of the Army's Pershing, spun him around, and told him how the problems they were having resulted from not having a necessary manual from Pershing's headquarters. And Pershing said, "Well, you know, we have our problems." And Marshall said, "Yes, I know you do, General, but ours are immediate and every day and have to be solved before night." If you haven't been in the military, it's hard to convey the vast gulf in rank, status, and power between the commanding general in a war and a junior officer. And correspondingly, how courageous it was for Marshall to stand up to Pershing, not for the purpose of being disrespectful or insubordinate, but to tell the general the hard truth of what he needed to know, in this case, the readiness of his army as it prepared for battle. Sure enough, after this meeting, Marshall was approached by other officers offering their condolences for the fact he was sure to be fired and sent to the trenches. But instead, Marshall became an invaluable advisor to Pershing, and Pershing a great mentor to Marshall. So Marshall has a lot to teach us about courage. The courage to do what is right and necessary, and not just what is popular. Educational institutions and business and government experts all talk and teach a lot these days about teamwork, about team building and consensus and collaborative efforts. And that's good. However, the time will inevitably come someday when you see something going on that you know is wrong or unwise. And you will at some point be called upon to stand alone and say, "This cannot be allowed." Don't kid yourself. That takes moral courage. Courage was a quality Marshall never lost, even as he climbed the military ranks and reached senior positions. 20 years after the confrontation with Pershing, Marshall, now a one-star general, was sitting in the White House with President Franklin D. Roosevelt and all of his top advisors and cabinet secretaries. War in Europe was looming, but still a distant possibility for America. And in that meeting, Roosevelt proposed that the U.S. Army, which at that time ranked in size somewhere between that of Switzerland and Portugal, should at that point have lower priority for funding and equipment than providing assistance to Great Britain to keep them in the fight. FDR's advisors nodded. Building the U.S. Army should wait. Then FDR, looking for the military's endorsement for a decision he'd already made, said, "Don't you think so, George?" Marshall, who hated being called by his first name, even by a president, said, "I'm sorry, Mr. President, but I don't agree with that at all." The room went silent. The Treasury Secretary told Marshall afterward, "Well, it's been nice knowing you." But it was not too much later that Marshall became Chief of Staff of the Army. Marshall, in this case, performed the ultimate act of loyalty to his commander-in-chief, which was to give his honest opinion instead of currying favor by going along with the consensus. But Marshall also was loyal when Roosevelt decided against him. He didn't run to the Congress. He didn't leak to the press. He saluted and obeyed. Both in offering honest advice and in obeying without complaint, Marshall kept his integrity intact, understanding that once someone compromises his or her integrity, it is difficult, if not impossible, to get it back.